Okay, good evening. I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Keisha Rogers, and I want to thank you for joining us for our LaRouche PAC strategic update and overview. I will be joined by my colleague, Michael Stager, who is going to give us our overview for the evening. I think that the title of Michael's presentation and the discussion for tonight is very appropriate and is termed Putin and Trump, Why Nations Rise and Ideologies Fall. And he's going to go into that a little bit more in detail. As today is October 3rd, we are on a complete battlefront right now to save the nation, to save the republic. And I very much took those words and that statement from President Donald Trump. As many of you know, in his recent rallies, he's made that mission and fight very clear as you see total destruction going on under the current administration, the Biden administration, drive toward war and drive toward financial and economic collapse. And there are no solutions coming out of the present establishment and no solutions coming from the Federal Reserve, the central bankers, Wall Street, the City of London. But the key right now is that what President Trump offered just a few days ago with the escalated tensions following the statements made by the Russian president on the question of what has just transpired in the victories, should we say, around the nations, around the territories that had a resolution, a referendum recently, and are now going to be permanently a part of Russia. But the reality is that what most people recognize is that it's not Russia that is the threat. It's not Putin that is the threat. It is the liberal order of the British imperial system that we have to, as Lyndon LaRouche, the founder of our political action committees, understood and fought for many years, we have to bring down this liberal imperial order and that nations have to work together. There are a number of people. One thing I want to point out to you, very important statement. Let me just pull this up here quickly, that if you missed it on our website, written by Barbara Boyd, in follow-up to President Trump's offer just a few days ago that negotiations were necessary to put an end to this war drive. And he actually called for basically being the negotiator and stepping in to negotiate between NATO and Russia and Ukraine. Now, he's not the only one who's calling for peace talks and negotiations in these areas. And I'm pointing out this statement here, Trump's offer to end the war or something similar should be accepted about right now. I would encourage everyone to go to the website and to read that statement. Now, at the same time, you've recently had a number of people, but I want to highlight statements that have come from Elon Musk, which we're going to be putting out a response and an article to this on our website. But I just want to highlight the fact that in TOS and also on a number of his tweets, Elon Musk has very clearly stated that victory for Ukraine unlikely in total war. Elon Musk says, he says, Ukraine is unlikely to win a total war with Russia. American businessman Elon Musk wrote on Twitter, quote, Russia is doing partial mobilization. They go to full war mobilization if Crimea is at risk. Death on both sides will be devastating, the tweet reads. Quote, Russia has 3 times the population of Ukraine, so victory for Ukraine is unlikely in total war. If you care about the people of Ukraine, seek peace, end quote, Musk added. So when you think about, I just want to add one last aspect to this. First of all, we know, and it was stated in the speech by the Russian President Putin, where this is coming from. This has been an ongoing drive for war that goes back to 2014, goes back to what we've been really pointing out and exposing around the Obama, Biden, the operations to fund Nazis in Ukraine. And it goes back to the continued drive for the lies around Russia, Russiagate, Putin, and so forth. And I think that right now, as Michael's going to discuss, this ideological system is coming down. The British imperial system is coming down. And we see this by the mass movement of patriotic citizens who recognize that they have to take the leadership in building the future for our nation, getting us out of these endless wars. As President Trump said, we are on a mission to save the republic. And as was stated in the invitation, I think that it's very clearly stated that the war in Ukraine will be where the British liberal empire goes to die, with the danger of war growing. This is the defining issue of November 2022 midterms. It's patriots versus the globalists. And that is absolutely true. Later on in the discussion, for those who participate in the follow-up discussion, and I will remind people, the opening remarks are recorded and made available here. If you'd like to participate in the live discussions, please go to our website and register to get our updates and join us if you are listening to this discussion on YouTube. But I think that this question of what we've seen in our mobilization, LaRouche Pact, to define the future, the economic solutions, in response going to the recent Trump rally in Warren, Michigan. And this was extremely important. We'll get some reports and some updates on that later in terms of the growing fight that's coming forth in the population. And you see that spirit growing across the nation, across the world right now. The example in Italy with the recent new prime minister that was elected, the conservative prime minister in Italy. That why is the liberal establishment freaking out about this? Because they want to continue to push their failed ideologies, and it's not going to work any longer. So let me go ahead and turn it over to Michael now, and we will have more discussion afterwards.
Thanks, Keisha. Welcome, everyone. So today's Monday, October 3rd, and I want to take up a certain aspect of this very dramatic strategic picture. And as many of you know, and the last couple of discussions we've had on Monday nights, 2 weeks ago, I led a discussion that opened up with a certain sense of how this current liberal ideology has attempted to control a sense of scientific thought, of a sense of our civilization. And I discussed it in terms of Manichaean separations of kind of an unseen or spiritual world and the so-called material world. Last week, Tony Papert discussed it in profound terms, really, of immortality. Joan of Arc, Martin Luther King, Lyndon LaRouche. The strategic situation is so dramatic, and the decisive aspects of this midterm election so important, that either we ourselves or colleagues or people that we're talking to in the general population feel overwhelmed. They can be a little bit brittle or tense. Some of them you can get pessimistic or cynical because of so many various aspects that seem against us. One of which, of course, is the blaring media. But, I had the chance to work with Lyndon LaRouche personally for about 20 years. And during that time, studied him very closely, reading all of the papers that he wrote throughout that period and many of the papers he wrote in previous periods. And there's one concept that always resonated with Lynn in terms of an outlook, a characteristic, which shaped his kind of calm focus at moments like this. Because as we know, and just to reshape it, or just to redefine it or restate it, you have a situation that, as Elon Musk has referenced today, could turn into nuclear war. Certainly you could see hundreds of thousands of people die just in traditional conflict in Ukraine. It's very likely that Russia is going to respond significantly once they consolidate the various referendums and turn the 4 regions into Russian territory. But what you saw with Putin's speech on Friday was a mobilization of a nation. And as Tony Pappert actually commented during last week, it was at the time of the space race when Kennedy had announced the space program to the American people and called on the American people in a kind of essential Kennedy fashion or quintessential Kennedy fashion. Not what country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, but now to accomplish a landing on the moon before the decade is out. That within the Soviet elites at that time, there was a reflection that we've lost the space race merely because Kennedy can mobilize the country while we're basically running a very high-level military intelligence program that is top secret, classified, and so on. And there are other economic aspects to the Soviet economy, but it was the spirit of the question as well, and perhaps most importantly. That's what you saw with Putin's rallying of the Russian people. And you see it in some ways indicated by the end of his speech when he references the kind of cultural madness that dominates Washington, D.C., Brussels, London, and this current globalist world structure. A loss of focus. And you see this in revolt, you see that in the elections in Italy and in Brazil. But the war danger is, of course, very real. Coupled with that, by no means separate, is the entire insanity towards global energy, the attempt by central banks, by private banks, to shut down any investment into basic energy supply has only been increased in magnitude of psychosis with the Ukraine conflict. Shutting down the Nord Stream pipelines with terrorist activity, basically shutting down the German industrial base, which is the heart of the European industrial productive economy. We're looking at a global crisis of production. Forget the stock market for a second. You're looking at a global crisis of actual physical production, not just microchips, basically everything from toilet paper, microchips, advanced industrial production, much of which is not like something you consume on a daily basis, but that every 3-5 years you'll replace certain equipment. But if that equipment is now shrinking today, you're looking at an economic crisis that only expands over time. It's not merely a financial crash and you have to deal with it. It's a prolonged breakdown of production, like we learned with COVID, the supply chain. On top of that, and this, of course, energy crisis, I think it was U.S. representatives who declared that this is a great opportunity for the United States to export liquid natural gas. Well, if we're going to be paying European prices, or if European prices are going to influence the cost of natural gas this winter here, every American is going to be hurting. As Trump said it at the Warren, Michigan rally on Saturday, inflation is going to be getting worse after the election. They're holding it at bay as best they can. But all Biden's Inflation Reduction Act has done is massively risen the cost of living and production, while maybe, increasing the doubt and confidence in the US government. Then you have the whole situation financially, which there's no reason to attempt to explain it. But many people who have 401ks think of their life savings as the Dow Jones Industrial Average. This is a growing crisis. And of course, it creates screeches from every financial analyst and stockbroker out there. But the big question is the deeper question on this climate change, shutdown of energy, shutdown of production. And so we have then, in this context of this kind of economic crisis and the danger of war, which if any of us, I mean, many of us, and probably most of you who are watching this global picture are not surprised by the fact that as a legitimate threat to this globalist system arises, with Trump and the America First MAGA movement in the United States, what we see in Italy, what we saw with the Dutch farmers, what we see in aspects of Putin and Russia, what we see in other aspects, the Brazil election is going to a runoff. There is a clamor to break from this neoliberal system. And as that threat grows, especially in power centers like the United States, and perhaps most importantly here, and I'll develop that point later in my comments, the desperation to threaten global panic, economic crisis and shutdown, the threat of nuclear war, broader conflict, the deaths of despair, of massive drug addiction and proliferation of drug supply, that these are their intrinsic responses. These are the only tools that this enemy has. They can't offer a sense of growth or development. So this election becomes critically important. If you're out there talking to people and watching indications, I think you'll agree with me that there are aspects that indicate a real potential shift of many people who are just sick of what they've been hearing, certainly since the COVID and probably much longer, but are beginning to realize as an alternative presents itself, as this kind of broader universal political uprising presents itself, that there is a real response. There's an alternative, something to vote for. As Joe Rogan put it, the famous podcaster, you basically have to vote Republican. And people see that, but there is at least some kind of, there are different candidates like Carrie Lake in Arizona, Tudor Dixon, Christina Caramo in Michigan, Senate candidates that are at least reflecting a different policy, J.D. Vance or Blake Masters or others, who are, at least at this point in their campaigns, opposing the insanity of this Ukraine war and breaking from it. And despite all the attempts to suffocate that, to block it out of the media, people are searching, looking, and responding to reality, something that no matter how much propaganda or ideological brainwashing you push, people are responding. So as we've said over the last number of weeks, there is a potential major victory awaiting us in November if we continue to mobilize. And as the email said today, to mobilize on these big questions. What direction of civilization are we taking? Are we going to look to collaborate with Russia, with major nations, and reject this entire climate change fiasco? It's time to become heretics of climate change, to be proud heretics of the pagan cult religion of climate change. Carbon dioxide is not a problem. It's just not a problem. Carbon dioxide is not a problem. It's not. And that should be clear. And so we should be mobilizing for a massive expansion of energy. The one thing you can do with energy is solve almost every other problem. And the one thing you can't do without energy is solve almost any problem. You have energy supply, you have an abundance of it, and you grow and you develop. Okay, so that situates it, I think, in simplified form, just the strategic perspective we have today and the changes we have to make. But as I began with and didn't really complete, Lyndon LaRouche's concept was the sense of singular moments, singular distinct points or moments in any really principled process. Really any dynamic of development, of change, does not just stay in a constant state of change. You can look, one of the most common features, if our education system worked, that would be highlighted for 3rd and 4th graders, would be why our calendar is as it is, that we have 12 months, which are based on the moon, more or less, the lunar cycle, though we have 13 lunar cycles per year, or approximately. And yet we have a solar calendar, that there's always something that doesn't match up perfectly. There is a kind of incongruity to the physical universe. It doesn't look mathematically clean. It's not something that you mathematically design. It's designed by a higher concept or by principle. And this is something that plays a big role in understanding how we operate and the power we have as citizens and as human beings today to be as successful as we intend to be. Because one thing to be just what they call, there's a funny story. Putin was asked, are you an optimist or a pessimist? And he gave a very classic Russian response. But it defines why optimism and pessimism are not the questions. He was asked, are you an optimist? He said, well, an optimist, he said, a pessimist can be given a glass of high quality brand cognac, and he can take a whiff of it, and a pessimist will say it smells like a cockroach. An optimist will be given a cockroach and say it smells like a high quality glass of cognac. He says, who would you rather be, the pessimist or the optimist? Now, that's a classical Russian response, I think. But the point I'm making is that it's a question of, it's not just I'm optimistic about what we can accomplish, but that in principle, as if almost it was an engineering question, but it's not engineering. It's a much higher quality of the human mind, but as with the same certainty, the quality of victory we can accomplish in this period, not merely in the election, because it's not a question of how many Republicans per se we elect. It is the quality of the Republicans, a new quality which is expressing itself in the candidacies. But even more importantly, it's a quality of the movement that's developing and where that comes from. And what LaRouche recognized was that there are moments when people begin to be governed by something far more powerful than what was governing them previously. Oftentimes, it's usually practical concerns. Finding a wife, a job, a husband, raising kids, getting gas, paying bills, surviving, vacations, entertainment. But all of a sudden, they're gripped as if by something from the heavens. And that this was a characteristic of a human process. And in the context of that, Lynn saw the power within those moments to break from any ideological cage. Any so-called system or structure that was established could then be broken at those moments. That the power of a population with that kind of grip by that heavenly force. So when Lynn recognized it, he saw it in World War II. He saw it in his time in India, and he also saw it in the course of historical studies. And he lived his life with the sense that we will reach a point of that nature. And once we do, it will be upon us, incumbent upon us, to make it a conscious question. And he spent his life to make that process, that dynamic, not something that merely grips us, but something that we can be self-conscious of even throughout the entire course of our lives. Very powerful. You think of someone like Plato who did something similar. There are other great minds that dedicated themselves in a similar way. I want to take that question Because when we look at this strategic picture and its intensity, there's no reason to discuss more and more of its parts. More importantly is to discuss the power and to make the power by which we can act upon such a moment more and more conscious. So to do that, I'd like to take up this question of the question of a nation state. Where do these nations come from? Because what we see is the rising of nations, the rising of patriots against the globalists, people that ascribe to some ideological power center, the climate change, the finance, the wars, the drugs, the kind of methods of control of population. Whereas nations reflect something different. Now, I was watching a discussion on Ukraine out of Yale University. There's a lot of the stuff on the internet. So many of you may watch similar questions or similar presentations just to see what people are saying. And a Yale professor of history made a point which exposes the underlying assumptions of this entire liberal system. And that was that the occurrence of nation states, Russia, the United States, France, England, what became Germany, what became Italy. And it's in some ways it becomes an ambiguous discussion when you start to reference these countries. But there's an intrinsic quality. It's not always boundaries per se. It's an intrinsic cultural question. He said that it's the probability of nations arising is near impossibility. A similar comment is made when you talk about the origins of life. Life is such an improbable thing that it occurs, tells us, is something that we have to, it's a miracle, it's an amazing question. And in some sense, the polemic that because of how rare it is, as if a diamond or something, as if it's a commodity, that how rare it is, how precious it is, how statistically improbable it is, means it has great value. That it has great value is something that is worth accepting. It's a fine conclusion. But is it really something statistically so improbable? Well, this gets us at the question of how this liberal system has been imposed. The belief that Francis Bacon and René Descartes invented science is a total fraud. And to accept then that they've defined science as merely the description, there's many nuances to what I'm going to present here. But in core, it holds that to reduce scientific thought or the idea of science to merely the discovery of describing what we see with mathematics is a complete absurdity. As if we define the universe and our knowledge of it by a statistical assessment that when something happens, it usually is followed then by something else happening. So if you drop a ball, that it will accelerate at a certain rate, or that when a ball of one weight hits the ball of another weight, there's a knowable interaction. That this kind of description of statistical phenomena, which is merely what Newton's law of gravitation, that two bodies attracting one another, it's a statistical evaluation, that we reduce a process to statistics. It may suffice when dealing with even planetary bodies, certainly billiard balls. In some level, and engineering uses this all the time. And in many cases, like on energy, we should follow the engineering. The engineering tells us we need more energy. The statistics is fine. If you're building a power plant, you're going to be using certain statistical questions. Absolutely fine, no problem there. But it breaks down at critical moments of historical, of the question of civilization. What do I mean by that? Well, take the opposite approach. Well, what's the opposite approach in science? The opposite approach would be to say there are principles, knowable principles, not mystically out there that we believe in, but that can become knowable to the human mind, knowable, demonstrable. That we can identify the principle that creates an incongruence between the cycle of the sun and the cycle of the moon, and perhaps how that's manifesting, which in itself, even though somewhat simplifies it, was the provocation for the discovery of the principle of gravitation. Decades before Newton presents his analysis, and it's questionable if it was actually Newton's. That the mind is provoked by certain ironies. Well, if we start from that standpoint, that characteristic of principle, we would ask ourselves, what is the very intrinsic nature of the human species? What does this species do? What does it accomplish? Does the human species increasingly go towards more and more chaos? Do we create greater and greater disorder? Now, if you looked at the world today, and this is the problem with many adolescents, when they look at the world today, such an idea conforms with what they see. Decaying infrastructure, decaying cities, increasing neurotic tendencies, increasing insanity in levels of politics, public health, you name it, education. But when we look at the course of history, we see that the very nature of human beings is to increase their quality of organization. If you look at the study by Thucydides of the civil war in the ancient Greece, the Peloponnesian War, it's a clear study for cultures subsequently of the lack of forming a coherent nation led to the Persian Empire manipulating the various aspects of the Greek world into a civil war. That very insight, that dramatic portrayal by Thucydides was the very basis for much of Hamilton's arguments in the Federalist Papers regarding why we had to form a true nation state, a constitutional republic, of unifying the various colonies into a single nation, for the very reason that let us not ignore the mistakes or the lessons learned from that tragedy of the loss of Greek civilization. And in doing so, in some sense, it's not lost. Well, you then look at the process of self-organization of a people, and you recognize that nations are an intrinsic expression of the characteristic principle governing human society. That may not be what it seems like through most of the time. From a statistical analysis, it doesn't look like we're watching these remarkable processes of the evolution of nations and of human civilization develop. But at moments like this, the approach we take, the statistical, cynical approach, or the question of the very principles that have led us to develop such powerful concepts, the ability for self-governing republics, as we see with what Putin has marshaled in Russia today, regarding this threat from this absolutely psychotic Western approach from Biden, from Obama, from Boris Johnson, very much a British approach. Let me just put a quick point on this. The first head of NATO, a man named Lord Ismay, better known as Lord Dismay, said the nature of NATO, this is somewhat, I don't have the quote in front of me, so this is somewhat paraphrasing. But the capture of it was to keep the United States in, Germany down, and Russia out. That was the British imperial policy following World War II and is the governing characteristic of NATO. It's a British imperial structure meant to keep us locked into British imperial policy in the continent of Europe, or in the 20-year war in Afghanistan, to keep Russia constantly as a situated enemy, not the Soviet Union, not an ideological structure of a state, that was always somewhat separate from the Russian people, but today it's Russia. It's not a Soviet Union. It doesn't have some ideological structure as its marketing agenda. And to see Germany down, but what are we doing to Germany today? So the situation is a British imperial policy. They've been promoting this statistical assessment, but what at moments such as this, what becomes so defining is our recognition of the power of these nations, the power of our nation, the power of our population in aggregate form around a common and coherent principle. And to be self-aware that this is the intrinsic governing principle of human identity, that this is what makes us distinct from any other animal species, that it's what makes us human. Now, the uniqueness of this question of the nation state is best expressed, is captured better than any other nation. When we talk about American exceptionalism, it's oftentimes abused by the creeps like Obama as kind of jingoistic jargon of British imperial policy, the exceptional nature of the Anglo-Saxon race or something, kind of a Winston Churchill-esque idea. But the true exceptional quality is the American people's and American cultural tradition of rejecting that imperialistic conception and to adopt not a contractual binding of states or of people, but to premise our nation on principle, on a principle of the success of the general welfare and of future generations, to make that the governing principle of our constitutional system, and to ask people to participate in that. That is uncharacteristic of any other nation in the world today in terms of its founding principles and characteristics. Some nations in Ibero-America, south of us, have adopted similar reflections of that dynamic, but it is unique to the United States. It is this question, this characteristic, which in some sense measures true science. Because is not science the advancing success of the human species to act upon the universe? Is that not how we measure the success of science? Not an increasing database of data or of statistical evaluations or of mathematical formulas, but the increasing coherence and power to act upon the universe. And that power to access principle that exists in one location, the individual human mind. This is the principle of the individual, and this is the principle of sovereignty of nations, to respect that and to foster it. We are on the verge of reclaiming our rightful heritage in the course of this election and the coming period as we head into a very contentious political kind of war to make this the governing principle of our country again. But it will also then reflect and reverberate throughout the nations of the world. And perhaps for the first time, such a concept, such a self-awareness of the profound nature of human existence and the formation of nations and the potential to collaborate with one another become possible because of that self-awareness of what we risk if we don't, but perhaps even more importantly, what we gain if we do. And this is maybe why Elon Musk's proposal is so important. We are going to have something on the website by Tony Papert this week, because Musk's proposal to basically create a peace settlement which would allow the regions of Ukraine to once again vote with UN occupation, which I don't necessarily trust Guterres at the United Nations right now, but the principle is right. But the real principle is the space program, the development, the industry, the energy supply, breaking from this climate change heresy or insanity. But the reflection of SpaceX and the space program is obviously very important. So in my mind, when I think of the role Lyndon LaRouche has played to help shape the potential today, not just in the United States, in Russia, in Italy, in Europe, in Brazil, in many of these countries, the concept that stands out is this recognition of what real science, real humanity, the real principles that govern not just the universe. You know, there's a joke today, and even some better scientists realize it. Physics can describe everything but the human, but it doesn't. But it doesn't describe, can't capture the human mind. So you're using the human mind to say you can define everything in the universe, but the human mind. That doesn't function. That's just an absurdity in itself. What we're starting from is the actual principle of the human mind and how that has led us to this point, and to recognize its power to resolve the intrinsic contradictions of the current system and to really advance the interests of our country, but in doing so, very much the interest of mankind as a whole. That to me is what we want to mobilize around. Not because we're going to have deep philosophical conversations with every person we might talk to, but it's these questions and principles which, if they govern us and they inspire our language, our ideas, will inspire and touch much of our country and much of the world today. That there is a dire hunger within the people of our country for this quality of commitment, for growth and for development, and to recognize the powers from which it comes. And not to pretend that somehow a great reset, ideological control, increasing structures of kind of, well, just controlling the population in various ways, degrading them, that somehow that will continue to, somehow it will suffice. It's what we're going to build and create, and understanding the principles and powers by which we can create it. I think we're going to be incredibly successful because of these powers, to the extent we can make them self-conscious. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say. Hopefully it was somehow coherent. And Keisha, I'll throw it back to you and see what kind of response we get, I guess.